Global debt just hit 111 trillion, 94.7% of world GDP. Every country is in debt. France owes 345 trillion, the US owes $38 trillion, Japan owes 230% of its GDP, China, Germany, UK, all deeply in debt. So here's the question nobody asks. If every country is a debtor, who's the creditor? The answer will shock you. It's not other countries. Only 32% of U.S. debt is foreign-owned. It's not China. They only hold $770 billion of U.S. debt out of $38 trillion, down from $1.3 trillion in 2013. It's not governments lending to each other at all. The creditors are domestic investors, pension funds holding retirement savings, insurance companies investing premiums, banks using depositor money, and ultimately the ultra-wealthy who own those institutions. The top 10% own 52% of all wealth in France, 70% in the US. When governments borrow $111 trillion, they're borrowing from their own rich citizens and paying them interest with taxes collected from everyone. Central banks also create debt by buying bonds with newly printed money. The Federal Reserve holds $4.8 trillion in US government bonds, but even that debt is owed back to the financial system. And when pension funds buy government bonds with worker savings, workers are lending to governments who tax them to pay interest back to their own pensions. It's a circular system where the wealthy collect interest on public debt. In this video, I'm exposing who actually owns the $111 trillion in global debt, why most debt is owed domestically, not internationally, how the ultra-wealthy profit from government borrowing, why this system creates a wealth transfer from taxpayers to bondholders, and what this means for your investments and savings. But before we expose who really owns global debt, if you want to understand how the financial system transfers wealth and how to position yourself on the right side of this massive transfer, subscribe to the Investor's Lens. We reveal the hidden mechanics of wealth. Hit subscribe now. But there's one fact about government debt ownership that is by far the most important, and it completely contradicts what most people believe. It's that most debt is owed domestically, not to foreign countries. And this changes everything about how we understand the debt crisis. Let me give you the numbers that prove this. The United States has $38 trillion in national debt. Of that, only $8.5 trillion is owned by foreign entities. That's just 22%. The remaining 78%, $29.5 trillion, is owned by domestic creditors, Americans lending to their own government. Wait, it gets more interesting. Japan has the highest debt to GDP ratio of any developed country at 230%, meaning they owe more than twice their annual economic output. But 90% of Japanese government debt is owned by Japanese citizens, banks, pension funds, and the Bank of Japan. Only 10% is foreign-owned. France's $345 trillion debt? About 80% is owned by French and other European investors. Only 20% is held by non-European foreign entities. Even China, which Americans think of as a major creditor, only holds $770 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds, down from $1.3 trillion in 2013. That's just 2% of U.S. debt. China is not funding America's deficit. Americans are funding it themselves. So who are these domestic creditors? Let me break it down. Pension funds are the largest category. In the U.S., public and private pension funds hold approximately $4.5 trillion in government bonds. These are retirement savings for teachers, firefighters, corporate employees, regular people who unknowingly own government debt through their retirement accounts. Insurance companies hold about $2.8 trillion in government bonds. When you pay insurance premiums, insurance companies invest that money in government bonds for safety and steady income. Banks hold approximately $3.2 trillion. When you deposit money in a bank, they don't just keep it in a vault. They invest a significant portion in government bonds. Your checking account balance is partially funding government debt. The Federal Reserve holds $4.8 trillion in U.S. government bonds, the largest single holder. But the Fed isn't a traditional creditor. It creates money to buy bonds through what's called quantitative easing or open market operations. This is essentially the government borrowing from itself through the central bank. Mutual funds and investment firms hold about $5 trillion. When you buy a bond mutual fund or a safe balanced fund, you're likely owning government bonds. Individual wealthy investors directly hold about $2.5 trillion in government bonds. High net worth individuals buy bonds for tax advantages and safe income streams. Here's why this matters. When politicians talk about owing money to China or foreign debt threatening national security, they're creating a false enemy. The real creditors are domestic. The government owes money primarily to its own citizens, or more accurately to the wealthy, citizens and institutions that can afford to buy bonds. And here's the critical insight. When you add up all these domestic creditors, pension funds, banks, insurance companies, investment firms, wealthy individuals, who ultimately owns and controls these institutions? The ultra-wealthy. The top 10% of Americans own 70% of all wealth. The top 1% own 32%. When you trace the ownership of pension funds through corporate control, banks, through major shareholders, insurance companies, through stockholders, and investment firms directly owned by the wealthy, you find that the wealthy elite are the ultimate creditors of government debt. So the answer to who's the creditor is the wealthy, lending to governments through financial institutions and collecting interest paid by taxes on everyone. But the mechanism of how this wealth transfer works is even more revealing. This next financial mechanism is perhaps the most important because it reveals how government debt systematically transfers wealth from the majority to the elite. It's the interest payment system, and the math is staggering. Here's how it works. Governments don't just borrow money, they borrow it at interest. When the U.S. government issues treasury bonds, it promises to pay bondholders a certain interest rate. Currently, that's about 4 to 5% on 10-year bonds. Let's do the math. The U.S. has $38 trillion in debt. At an average interest rate of 4%, that's $152 trillion in annual interest payments. At 5%, it's $1.9 trillion. To put that in perspective, the entire U.S. defense budget is $850 billion. Interest payments on the debt are nearly double the entire military budget. It's the third largest item in the federal budget after Social Security and Medicare. And who receives that $152 trillion in interest? The creditors we just identified: pension funds, banks, insurance companies, investment firms, and wealthy individuals. But wait, where does the government get $1.52 trillion to pay? Interest? From taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, payroll taxes, all collected from workers and businesses. Here's the wealth transfer cycle. Step 1. Government borrows $38 trillion by selling bonds. Step 2. Wealthy individuals and institutions buy those bonds. Step 3. Government collects taxes from everyone: workers, middle class, small businesses. Step 4. Government pays $1.52 trillion in interest to bondholders, the wealthy. Step 5. Wealthy bondholders receive tax-free or low-taxed interest income. Step 6. Repeat annually forever. This is a systematic transfer of wealth from taxpayers to bondholders. And because the wealthy own most bonds, it's a transfer from the majority to the elite. Let's extend this globally. World debt is $111 trillion. At an average interest rate of 5%, that's $3.3 trillion to $5.5 trillion in annual interest payments flowing from governments to creditors worldwide. That's $3.3 to $5.5 trillion every single year being transferred from taxpayers, workers, middle class, small businesses to creditors, wealthy bondholders, pension funds controlled by the wealthy, banks owned by the wealthy. And here's what makes it insidious. Most people don't realize they're part of this system. When you pay income tax, a portion goes to interest on debt, which flows to wealthy bondholders. You're working to pay interest to the rich. But won't Social Security and pension funds benefit since they hold bonds? Yes and no. Pension funds do receive interest, which helps pay retirees. But those same retirees also pay taxes that fund the interest payments. And most importantly, the ultimate owners of the pension fund management companies, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, are wealthy shareholders. Plus, inflation erodes the value of those interest payments. If bonds pay 4% but inflation is 3%, the real return is only 1%. For wealthy bondholders with diversified portfolios, that's fine. For retirees dependent on fixed pension income, inflation slowly destroys their purchasing power, and corporations benefit too. When companies hold cash, they invest in government bonds. Apple holds $150 billion in cash and investments, much of it in treasury bonds. So taxpayers fund Apple's bond interest income. The system is designed to benefit those with capital. If you're wealthy enough to own bonds, you receive steady interest income paid by taxpayers. If you're middle class paying taxes, you're funding that interest with no direct benefit. This isn't a conspiracy. It's just how the system works. Government debt is a wealth transfer mechanism from the many to the few, and with $111 trillion in global debt, the transfer is enormous. But there's an even stranger creditor that most people don't understand. Here's the creditor that seems to break all the rules of finance, and understanding it reveals the ultimate truth about modern money. It's central banks. And they own trillions in government debt that they created out of thin air. Let me explain this carefully, because it sounds impossible, but it's real. The Federal Reserve owns $4.8 trillion in U.S. government bonds. The European Central Bank holds similar amounts of European government debt. The Bank of Japan owns over half of all Japanese government bonds. But here's the twist. Central banks bought these bonds with money they created. They didn't save up cash. They didn't collect deposits. They simply created money electronically and used it to buy government bonds. This is called quantitative easing or open market operations, but it's essentially debt monetization, the government borrowing money that the central bank creates. Here's how it works in practice. Step 1. U.S. Treasury issues $1 trillion in bonds, government borrowing. Step 2. Federal Reserve creates $1 trillion in new money electronically. Step 3. Fed uses that new money to buy the Treasury bonds. Step 4. Treasury receives $1 trillion in usable cash, newly created. Step 5. Fed now holds $1 trillion bonds. Treasury owes $1 trillion to Fed. This seems like magic. The government borrowed $1 trillion, but instead of owing it to Chinese investors or American bondholders, it owes the money to the Federal Reserve, which created the money to lend in the first place. Does the government really owe money to an entity that created that money out of nothing? And if the Fed owns U.S. government debt, doesn't that mean the government owes money to itself, since the Fed is technically part of the U.S. monetary system? Technically, yes. But there's a catch. The Federal Reserve is independent and operates like a private entity even though it's government created. And the Fed remits its profits, including interest from government bonds, back to the Treasury after paying expenses and dividends to member banks. So in a sense, when the government pays interest on bonds held by the Fed, most of that money comes back to the Treasury. It's a circular flow, and this is crucial, the money supply has still increased. When the Fed created $1 trillion to buy bonds, that money entered the economy. It didn't disappear just because the government borrowed it. Banks received that money, lent it out, and it multiplied through the fractional reserve system. The result? Inflation. More money chasing the same amount of goods and services means prices rise. So while the government didn't owe the money to external creditors, it still created inflation that affects everyone. The cost of borrowing from the central bank is paid through currency debasement. Your dollars buy less because more dollars exist. This is why economists call inflation a hidden tax. When the government borrows from the central bank, it's essentially taxing everyone through inflation rather than through explicit taxation. And who suffers most from inflation? The middle class and poor, who hold cash savings and earn wages that don't keep up with price increases. The wealthy who own assets, stocks, real estate, businesses, see their asset values rise with inflation. So even when the government borrows from the magical creditor, the central bank, it's still a wealth transfer, just hidden through inflation rather than explicit interest payments. The central bank as creditor is an illusion. The real creditors are still the wealthy, who profit when asset prices rise due to monetary expansion. But there's one group that suffers most from this entire system. Here's who actually bears the burden of $111 trillion in global debt, and it's not who you think. It's the middle class. And they pay through three hidden mechanisms. First, taxes. As we established, governments pay interest on debt through tax revenue. In the U.S., that's $1.52 trillion annually just for interest, money that could fund infrastructure, education, or healthcare. Instead, it flows to bondholders. Middle-class workers pay the highest effective tax rates. The wealthy use tax loopholes, offshore accounts, and capital gains rates, lower than income tax rates. Corporations use tax havens and deductions. The poor often don't earn enough to pay significant income taxes. The middle class carries the tax burden, which means they're funding the interest payments to wealthy bondholders. Second, inflation. When central banks print money to buy government bonds, it creates inflation. Prices rise, but wages don't keep pace. From 2020 to 2024, the money supply increased 40% in the U.S. Inflation surged. Housing costs, food, energy, everything got more expensive. Nominal wages rose maybe 10–15%, but real purchasing power declined. Who suffers? Middle-class families with fixed incomes, savings in cash, and expenses that rose faster than income. The wealthy, holding assets that inflated in price, got richer. Third, opportunity cost. The $152 trillion spent on debt interest could have been invested in the economy. Infrastructure projects create jobs. Education spending improves workforce skills. Healthcare spending improves productivity. Instead, that money goes to bondholders who mostly reinvest in more financial assets, not productive economy. It's a dead weight loss. Money that could create growth instead maintains the debt system. And here's the brutal reality. The debt keeps growing. U.S. debt increased from $10 trillion in 2008 to $38 trillion in 2025. That's a 280% increase in 17 years. Interest payments have tripled. At current trajectory, by 2035, interest payments could exceed $3 trillion annually, more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare, potentially the largest single budget item. Who will pay that $3 trillion? Taxpayers. Which taxpayers? Primarily the middle class. Meanwhile, who receives that $3 trillion? Bondholders. Who are the bondholders? Primarily the wealthy. The debt system is a wealth transfer machine, and the middle class is on the losing side. They pay taxes that fund interest to wealthy bondholders. They suffer inflation that erodes their savings. They lose government investment that could improve their lives. And there's no escape. You can't opt out of taxes. You can't avoid inflation. You can't stop governments from borrowing more. The only solution is to position yourself on the right side of this transfer. Own assets that benefit from debt and inflation, rather than cash and wages that get destroyed. So what should you actually do? Here's exactly how to protect yourself and potentially profit from the $111 trillion debt system. Strategy 1. Own real assets that inflate in value as money supply grows. Real estate, stocks, commodities, precious metals. As governments print money and create inflation, these assets rise in nominal value. The wealthy understand this. That's why they own assets, not cash. Your goal: become an asset owner. Strategy 2. Own government bonds, if wealthy. If you have significant capital, bonds provide steady income paid by taxpayers. It's the right side of the wealth transfer. High net worth individuals hold bonds for exactly this reason. For most people without large capital, bonds don't make sense. The returns barely beat inflation. Strategy 3. Minimize cash holdings. Cash loses value through inflation. Keep only emergency funds in cash, 3 to 6 months' expenses. Invest everything else in assets. Strategy 4. Understand tax strategy. The wealthy pay low taxes because they earn through capital gains and dividends, lower tax rates, rather than wages, higher rates. Learn to generate investment income, not just wage income. Strategy 5. Invest in inflation. Beneficiaries: companies that benefit from inflation. Banks, lending at higher rates, commodities producers, real estate, infrastructure. These thrive when money supply expands. Strategy: hedge with precious metals. Gold and silver protect against currency debasement. Central banks can't print gold. When debt grows unsustainably, precious metals surge. The bottom line? The $111 trillion debt system transfers wealth from taxpayers to asset owners. Be an asset owner. So we've exposed who really owns the $111 trillion in global debt. The answer: mostly domestic creditors, pension funds, banks, insurance companies, and ultimately the ultra-wealthy who control those institutions, 68% domestic, only 32% foreign. The interest payment wealth transfer of $335.5 trillion annually flowing from taxpayers to bondholders. How central banks create money to buy government bonds, causing inflation that acts as a hidden tax. Who really pays for all this debt? The middle class, through taxes, inflation, and lost opportunity. And exactly how to position yourself on the right side of this massive wealth transfer through asset ownership. These are the mechanics of the debt system that school never taught you and media never explains. But here's something I didn't tell you at the start of this video. Everything I just shared is completely useless if you don't know which specific assets will perform best as the $111 trillion debt grows to $150 trillion, which currencies will survive the debt crisis, and which countries might actually default. Without this knowledge, you'll be caught unprepared. Comment under this video, and I will reveal the 5 assets that will thrive as global debt spirals out of control and how to protect 100% of your wealth from the coming debt reckoning. I'll see you in the next one.